Imagine living in America for 25 years, and one wrong gesture drags you back into the past you've spent half your life outrunning. It was supposed to be an easy morning for Judge Caprio. Routine infractions, small fines, the gentle rhythm of Providence waking up. People chuckled at their own mistakes. The judge teased them back with the warmth of an old friend. Everything moved lightly, predictably, until the bailiff called the next name. Alexei Miller. A man in his late 50s stepped through the doorway, and the air in the courtroom shifted before he even reached the podium. His stride wasn't fast, but it carried the certainty of someone who rarely waited for permission. His shoulders stayed loose, almost too relaxed for a hearing, and on his face, half a smile, not arrogant, not friendly, but the kind you see on someone who believes he already knows how the next 5 minutes will go. He nodded at the judge as though greeting a colleague he once worked beside. Not disrespectful, just wrong enough to make the audience straighten in their seats. Judge Caprio read the first line of the report. Aggressive parking, disorderly conduct. A simple case, one he expected to settle in under a minute. But then it happened. When the judge asked for clarification, Alexei made a small, sharp gesture with his hand, an impatient slicing motion, unconscious, reflexive. In Rhode Island, it looked like a signal to shut someone down, a disrespectful interruption. A handful of people in the back exchanged glances. Someone whispered, "Did he just—" Caprio paused, not offended, just alert. "Sir, we don't interrupt here," he said calmly. Alexei met his eyes unbothered and answered in a quiet tone that somehow carried through the room. "Judge, I've dealt with much stricter men than you." He didn't say it with challenge. If anything, it sounded like an observation, one that didn't belong in a municipal courtroom at 9 a.m. The room froze. Caprio lowered his gaze to the file again, turning a page he had skimmed earlier. And for the first time that morning, his expression changed, not dramatically, just enough for the clerk beside him to glance over. Previous employment: consultant for a foreign security organization. Country of origin: Russia. Naturalized U.S. citizen. It wasn't incriminating, but it was unusual. He looked up slowly. For the first time since entering, Alexei's smile faded, only a fraction, but enough to reveal a tension under the surface, like a wire pulled tight inside him. The audience felt it too, heads lifted. The easy atmosphere evaporated, replaced by something quieter, heavier. No one could explain why. Nothing overtly threatening had happened. Yet, the silence deepened, as though everyone sensed they'd stepped into a story with far more weight than a parking violation. Caprio leaned forward slightly, measuring the man in front of him. The judge's voice remained steady, but the warmth of earlier cases wasn't there anymore. "Mr. Miller," he said, "let's start again." Alexei didn't respond. His eyes didn't wander. They held steady, like someone bracing for a conversation he'd tried to avoid for years. And in that stillness, in that held breath of a room where ordinary people came to solve ordinary problems, something unspoken passed between the two men. This hearing wasn't going to stay ordinary. Judge Caprio adjusted his glasses slightly, one of those subtle gestures he made when shifting from small talk to real examination. "Mr. Miller," he said, tone measured, "what is it you do now?" Alexei answered without hesitation, but the delivery was clipped, almost rehearsed. "Financial consulting, independent work. I've lived here in Providence for a long time." He said it as if the subject bored him, yet something in that phrasing made the judge tilt his head. A long time. It didn't match the address in the report. A recent residency in another part of the state he hadn't mentioned. A small inconsistency, but enough to make the judge's intuition sharpen. Before he could pursue it, the clerk stepped forward and quietly placed a folded note by his hand. Caprio opened it, brows lifting a fraction. "The complainant is present," he announced. All eyes turned as an elderly man stood from the second row. His posture was firm despite his age, his gaze steady, the kind you only see in someone who spent years learning how to read danger before it arrives. A veteran, his bearing made that clear even without a uniform. He didn't glare at Alexei. He simply watched him, attentive, like a man trying to identify something that refuses to surface. Caprio returned to the case. "Mr. Miller, according to the report, there was an exchange between you and this gentleman prior to the incident. Would you explain what happened?" A brief shadow crossed Alexei's expression, something between annoyance and caution. "I'd rather not revisit it," he said quietly. "Some history is better left where it is. You don't know how quickly it can stir things up for people in this room." The words weren't a threat, but they held a weight that made several people shift in their seats. Even the veteran's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he recognized the tone. Caprio studied Alexei's hands, steady, but held too close to his body, as if by habit rather than choice. His voice stayed calm. "This is a court of law, Mr. Miller. If something affects the case, it needs to be addressed." Alexei exhaled once, slow, controlled. "I wasn't hostile. If anything, I reacted before thinking, that's all." But something in the room pushed back against the explanation. The veteran didn't move, yet his focus intensified, as though he were seeing not the man before him, but a version of him from another time. The judge noticed. "Sir," Caprio said to the veteran, "if you have something relevant you wish to say, you may do so later. For now, let's keep the record clear." The older man simply nodded. Caprio turned back to Alexei and for the first time asked a question with a layer beneath it. "Are you certain there's nothing in your past that influences how you respond today?" A flicker, barely visible, ran through Alexei's posture. His jaw tightened only once before he smoothed it over. "My past," he said, "is the reason I avoid certain conversations. It keeps people safe." That statement landed like a dropped weight. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't self-pitying. It was quiet, but it carried the tone of someone who had spent years avoiding the wrong attention. Caprio observed him for a long second, then closed the folder gently, signaling a shift in direction. "This court isn't here to expose your life, but we do need clarity. And right now, your answers raise more questions than they settle." The veteran's gaze lingered on Alexei with a strange mix of familiarity and unease, as if he had finally put a name to something he'd sensed the moment the man walked in. Alexei kept his eyes forward, resisting the pull of those unspoken judgments. The room felt tighter, the air heavier, not with fear, but with the silent understanding that nothing about this case was simple. Not anymore. Judge Caprio turned his attention to the monitor beside him. "Let's review the parking footage," he said. The screen flickered, and a grainy recording filled the room. It showed Alexei's car pulling in too close to a hydrant, then stopping at an awkward angle, nothing serious by itself. But a moment later, the elderly veteran approached him. The two exchanged words, brief but charged, their postures rigid, their faces tense. There was no audio. Caprio leaned closer, watching the interaction frame by frame. Something in Alexei's shoulders, coiled, defensive, made him pause. He looked up. "Mr. Miller, what was discussed here?" Alexei kept his gaze on the table. "It doesn't concern the violation." "It does if it led to this," Caprio replied, voice firmer than before. A faint tremor of irritation passed through Alexei's expression, quickly suppressed. "It wasn't meant to escalate. I told him to leave it alone." The judge straightened. "You're not in a position to withhold context. Answer the question." Before Alexei could respond, the veteran rose quietly. His voice carried a steady weight. "He wasn't hostile," the man said. "He was unsettled." "I've seen that look before." Dozens of heads turned. The veteran continued, his tone measured. "I served overseas. I've met men who came back from places where Instincts get burned into you. He has that same alertness. Not aggression, something else. Alexei stiffened but didn't look at him. Judge Caprio regarded the veteran thoughtfully. Are you implying prior conflict between you two? No, the older man said. Only that I recognize something familiar. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, confusion, curiosity, and a faint unease. Alexei's jaw tightened, and for the first time, he shifted his stance with discomfort he couldn't fully mask. Caprio's tone softened only slightly, but gained an edge of seriousness. Mr. Miller, there are discrepancies in your file. Your early records show residence under a different name. You left Russia before the turn of the century, and your prior employment, he tapped the paper, is described in vague terms. Why? The question landed hard. Alexei's hand hovered near the edge of the podium, fingers curling once before releasing. He met the judge's eyes with a steadiness that seemed to cost him effort. Because that life is gone, he said quietly, and explaining it will not help anyone in this courtroom. His voice didn't break, but something in it thinned, like a layer of steel worn down by years of pressure. Caprio studied him with a calm that felt almost surgical. The judge didn't flinch, didn't lean back, didn't allow the weight of that answer to sway him. This isn't about exposing you, he said. It's about understanding your behavior today. Alexei looked away, just for a second, but the motion revealed the smallest crack in his composure. The veteran noticed. So did half the room. Judge, the veteran said softly, whatever he's carrying, he's been carrying it alone. The remark released a strange silence. People weren't afraid. They were uncertain, sensing the boundaries of this case stretching into territory none of them had expected. Alexei finally spoke again, his voice a shade lower. Certain histories don't stay quiet when you bring them up. That's why I avoided the conversation, that's all. But the room felt the lie by omission, the kind spoken not to deceive, but to survive. Caprio folded his hands. Mr. Miller, he said, your reaction tells me there is more at stake than a parking dispute. And Alexei, for the first time, didn't deflect. A slight tremor of openness crossed his features, reluctant, exhausted. You're not wrong, he admitted, but I'm not ready to say it. The tension didn't explode. It settled, heavy, unspoken, undeniable, marking the moment the case stopped being about the violation and became something far deeper. The courtroom had settled into a dense silence, the kind that gathers when everyone senses a truth approaching, but no one knows its shape. Judge Caprio rested his hands on the bench, his voice steady but edged with unmistakable intent. Mr. Miller, he said, I need you to be direct. These half-answers imply there is more you're avoiding. What exactly is it you fear will be revealed? Alexei didn't respond right away. His eyes lowered, not out of submission, but as though he were choosing which doors in his memory he dared to open. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, too calm. I never served as an operative, he said, but for a stretch of time, I worked alongside individuals who are now considered adversaries of this country. Gasps fluttered through the room, small, startled sounds, quickly stifled by the awareness of where they were. Not panic, not drama, just disbelief that such a confession would surface in a municipal courtroom tucked between parking fines and noise violations. Alexei raised his head, offering no apology for the weight of his words. I didn't realize where those connections would lead. I left it behind long before I came here, but shadows don't vanish just because you walk away. He spoke without self-pity, but with the tone of a man stating a simple, cold fact. Judge Caprio observed him with the same expression he used when listening to a fragile testimony. Cautious, neutral, but unmistakably attentive. If you've severed ties, he asked, why conceal your history in the records? Because, Alexei replied, the past doesn't always stay buried. and there are people I prefer not to remind of my existence." Before Caprio could respond, the veteran lifted his hand slightly, a quiet request to speak. The judge nodded. The older man stepped forward just enough to be heard clearly. "Judge, he's telling the truth about one thing. Whatever he was part of, it changed him. I can see it in the way he stands, the way he scans a room without thinking." His tone wasn't accusatory. It carried the authority of someone who had survived places civilians never hear about. "In Europe," he continued, "I met men who kept their histories locked away because speaking them aloud felt dangerous. Not illegal, dangerous." His words didn't justify Alexei. They contextualized him. Alexei remained motionless, but his eyes softened only slightly, as if surprised that someone else recognized the weight he carried. Judge Caprio reopened the file, flipping to a section he had skimmed earlier. His brow tightened. "There's a recent financial review attached to your name," he said. "It mentions a false address, not for fraud, but due to concerns about being located by unidentified individuals." The room reacted with a hushed ripple. Not fear, understanding. Caprio looked directly at him. "Are you avoiding law enforcement?" "No." Alexei's reply came quickly, almost relieved to be able to answer something plainly. "I'm avoiding the kind of people who don't knock." The judge leaned back slightly, considering the man before him with renewed clarity. "So you're not fleeing from justice," Caprio said. "You're fleeing from your own past associations." "Yes," Alexei answered, the word landing with the heaviness of a door finally closing behind him. "I cut ties, but not everyone accepted that. Yeah, I've been trying to stay one step ahead ever since." There was no melodrama in his tone, just exhaustion, finely hidden until now. Caprio folded the papers deliberately, signaling that he had heard enough for the moment. "Mr. Miller," he said quietly, "running from something does not excuse bringing that tension into this courtroom. But it does explain your behavior." Alexei's shoulders lowered, barely perceptible, as though some unseen pressure had eased for the first time. The veteran nodded once, in a gesture that wasn't sympathy or approval, just recognition. And the room, though still tense, shifted from suspicion to something more complex. A collective sense that they were witnessing a man caught between the life he built and the life that refused to let him go. The weight of Alexei's admission lingered in the room like a slow-moving storm, drawing every gaze toward him. Judge Caprio allowed a brief pause, not to dramatize, but to separate the man's past from the legal moment unfolding before them. "Mr. Miller," he began, voice steady, "you're not being judged for where you were born or the choices you made before stepping onto American soil. My concern is simple. Did your conduct today break the law?" Alexei's features softened, though not with vulnerability, more like resignation. "Yes," he said. "I spoke sharply. I reacted without thinking. But not out of hostility. I don't respond well to uniforms or authority figures. That's all I can say. It wasn't an excuse. It was an admission forged out of discomfort rather than defiance." The veteran stepped forward again, his tone gentler than before. "I know that feeling," he said. "When I came home, I didn't trust anyone who had the right to give orders. It took me years to relearn it. You're not the only one who carries old habits into new places." Alexei looked at him for the first time. Really looked. There was no challenge in his eyes now, no concealed superiority. Just a flicker of recognition between two men whose pasts had carved similar grooves into their lives. But he returned his attention to the judge almost immediately. "Judge Caprio," he said, voice lower, "there is another reason I keep things to myself." He hesitated, choosing each syllable with care. "If I reveal what I've tried to leave behind, certain people may trace it, and if they do, it won't stay quiet." This time, the room didn't stiffen. Instead, it seemed to exhale, a collective sense that the danger he described wasn't cinematic, but deeply personal. The kind that follows immigrants from unstable regions, not because of crimes committed, but because of desperate choices made in the wrong company. Judge Caprio leaned slightly forward, balancing authority with empathy. "You're not obligated to recount every chapter of your past here," he said. "But you must understand something. Fear, whether justified or imagined, does not grant permission to disrupt public order. Not in this courtroom, and not in this city." Alexei held his gaze, absorbing the words like someone unaccustomed to straightforward counsel. The judge continued, his tone deepening in conviction. "This courtroom is a small place, but its purpose is large. Everyone who stands here deserves fairness, and that includes you. But fairness requires respect. If you let old fears dictate your behavior, you lose control over your own life, and over the new one you're trying to build." The room had gone silent again, but not with tension. This time, with attention. Even the clerk, who had processed thousands of hearings, paused her writing. For the first time since entering, Alexei's posture changed. The rigid composure eased, not collapsing, but loosening, as if a burden he never acknowledged had been recognized aloud. "You're right," Alexei murmured, barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to outrun something that doesn't care how far I go. And I brought that edge in here. I shouldn't have." The veteran nodded subtly, the gesture carrying weight without a single spoken word. Judge Caprio rested his palms on the bench. "Then let today be a turning point," he said. "Not for your record, for your peace. If this country offers anything, it's the chance to start over. But you must meet it halfway." Alexei didn't bow his head. He simply breathed, deeply, steadily, as if reclaiming a part of himself he hadn't touched in years. And in that quiet moment, every person in the courtroom sensed that something inside him had shifted. Not entirely, and not permanently, but noticeably. Judge Caprio let the room settle before delivering his decision. His voice, when it came, carried neither triumph nor severity. It held something steadier, an understanding born of decades spent guiding strangers through their smallest and worst moments. "Mr. Miller," he said, "this court isn't blind to struggle, but it also can't ignore conduct. Your fine will be reduced to the minimum allowed. However, I am issuing an official warning regarding your manner toward the court." He paused, allowing the words to land without harshness. "America gives people room to rebuild, but rebuilding begins with respect. If you want this country to trust you, you must show you trust it enough to stand here as an equal, not as a man expecting the past to ambush him at every corner." Soft applause rose from a few benches, not celebratory, but appreciative, as if the room recognized the dignity of the moment. Even Alexei seemed taken, aback by the gentle reaction, his posture tightening, then gradually easing. Caprio continued more quietly now. "You are not defined by what you ran from, Mr. Miller, but you will be defined by how you choose to live going forward." The judge gestured that the hearing was concluded. Alexei stepped back from the podium, slower than before, as though weighing each movement. He turned to leave, but the veteran who had spoken earlier approached him with deliberate calm. "Hey," the older man said, voice low enough not to intrude on the room's quiet. "If you ever need someone who understands what it means to sleep with old ghosts, I'm around." It wasn't an offer of friendship. It wasn't sympathy. It was a bridge, small, sturdy, offered from one survivor to another. Alexei inhaled deeply, his eyes flicking toward the man with a mixture of surprise and quiet gratitude. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave a single respectful nod, something far more sincere than the practiced half-smile he had carried when he entered. The veteran returned the nod and stepped aside. Alexei moved toward the exit, but just before crossing the threshold, he stopped. For a moment he stood very still, as though gathering the courage for a gesture he wasn't accustomed to making. He turned back to the judge. "Judge Caprio," he said, voice steady but softer than at any previous point. "Thank you. It's been a long time since anyone spoke to me without suspicion. Whatever happens next, I'll remember that." The courtroom didn't breathe. His words weren't dramatic. They were direct, unguarded, rare. But then he added something else, a quiet, unsettling truth, not ominous, but undeniably real. "And you're right. This isn't over." He didn't elaborate. He simply walked out, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click. Caprio watched the empty doorway for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he exhaled, a barely audible sigh, the kind that comes from witnessing a life balanced on a delicate edge. Almost to himself, he murmured, "I hope he finds his way back." No one responded. The room remained still, carrying the echo of a story that had ended only on paper, its real conclusion unfolding somewhere beyond the courthouse walls, in the life of a man finally forced to face the shadows he had outrun for decades. And just like that, the next case was called. But the people who had witnessed the hearing would remember it long after they left, the quiet struggle, the fragile dignity, the sense that behind one ordinary violation lay a history that would never fully reveal itself, yet had nevertheless brushed against their own lives for a single unforgettable morning.